Hello everyone, today we talk about the Kievan Rus. We already made some introductions to specific aspects, especially in the early history of this Slavic power for our regional series, looking at the fact that the foundation of the same princely institution, the Rurikids, the early contact with Constantinople, the general international scenario in which the Kievan Rus came to expand and to operate. Today we talk about the rest of its history, so not in a contextual way, but rather as the whole package, right? It's a bit different from our videos from the original series because it's actually a lot of centuries, right? We will be covering from the end of the 10th to essentially the end of the 13th, the beginning of the 14th even. And so it's much like a broader take on this system. The eastern you go in Europe and the least stability you find historically, and albeit it's I think very important for many reasons at this point in history to stress the importance, the centrality of the Kievan Rus, especially, in fact, for Eastern Europe. Also have to appreciate, also as a broader, again, Eastern Slavic area, the limits of the system. Recently I made an interview, and I will not reveal you the details because it's gonna come out, I think I was told at the beginning of May, on YouTube, so by a much bigger channel. I will not make the name because at least this is something that must be uploaded yet. I don't know whether how it's going to work. It's part of a broader series he makes, and I discussed essentially. I told him some video, but I did it last week, right, about the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and so also great part of Ruthenian history during the same period. Right. Today we will not look at that. I actually made a video on medieval Lithuania, which was during the 13th to 14th century, among the others, on Lithuanian history I made, that addresses, in fact, that is the same one that drew the attention to my channel, and that sort of explores also that very important time in Ruthenian history, in Russian history, as far as the actual incorporation of most of the previous Rus into the so-called Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and how this managed even to, in fact, to incorporate such an immense territory. As you know, again, we're not talking about this today, but there is a massive intertwinement between essentially what was Ruthenian cultural superiority over Lithuania, right? Lithuania is something completely different, but mostly, say, most of the nationalization dynamics occur to that history. I mean, while the Poles were passing from Latin to vernacular Pole, in fact, the Lithuanians were importing Church Slavonic that had nothing to do with their language from Ruthenia that was much more advanced. It sort of helped, in fact, the Grand Duchy also to affirm itself. So there was a massive Russian civilization, especially in the areas that had been the center of the Kievan Principality, the same Kiev, and also especially at that point the so-called Russian Palatinate in the west, right? And I made a video about the kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia, right? So called because at one point it technically was actually a Roman Catholic Russian power, right? And so there is really a lot of that happened after the Mongol invasions. So in a moment, as we will see now, severe disgregation of the system. But it's also an interesting topic. I was very tempted to make a very long video based on Tucker's interview to Putin and sort of the fantasy, like his sort of I don't even know how to qualify that that for obvious political reasons, right, has been sorted out, incomplete it's not just for the fact that it's in disagreement with history at a broader level, but of course, as always, like how you feed this. Well, okay, Tucker is an idiot, of course. Has nothing to do with any form of European identity or tradition or Western superiority at that level. But he wouldn't know. He was not a qualified person. You can't even fully blame him for that. That's the least of the thing. You can't blame him for that interview, as well as the other nonsense. Oh, look, in this supermarket, the Russians have same stuff we do. Well, you may want to look at what's the Russian purchase power before making such bizarre statements. But I understand that the majority of people in the same West now is culturally underdeveloped, and there is nothing absolutely strange of fitting this kind of subcultural garbage to them, because that's what their sole identity is based on. But the mere fact that Putin would be talking about that period and drawing the attention on that, and as you know, I made actually a series on Ukrainian history back in the day when the war, at least the 2022 invasion began, and man, there's actually a lot behind that, right? It's not just saying, the notion, of course, of say, let's suppose the Russians or the Ukrainians or whatever, let's be honest, like both sides today, the majority of people, liberals, conservatives, have no idea about the history of the region, right? But if they did, they would be, of course, appreciating much better what, obviously enough, what the substance is, but also reevaluating dramatically the role of Ruthenian culture and what eventually passed to be, especially the Ukrainian one, into the same development and the opportunity and potential of Western civilization. But it is also a tragic history, one of limits and failures that you have to understand as well, because nobody won. At that point, we're talking 13th or 14th century, where we stop now. But it's something that dates back to the before. I made another video about the the similarities between the Poland of the Piasts and, in fact, the Rus of the Rurikids, because there are actually lots of similarities, right? What Eastern Europe became, to be known to us, aside from the more recent, the socialist history and all this stuff, but in fact, that severely different land that is also from Central Europe. I mean, there is an abyss, say, between Poland and Lithuania, for example. Not so much even between, in fact, the Rusian Palatinate and because it's much more like of a Central European area. Like, as you know, even today's Ukraine is in the western part in very specific ways, aside from the ethnicities that do exist at the frontiers, well, from other, say, from groups that are further west, is actually Central Europe, right? Ukraine enters the Carpathians, right? And so it's the Carpathian Basin, and that's all something, of course, that also is due to later changes, whatever. But the proximity of those lands culturally, but even further east, right, before the Mongol invasions, is incredibly strong, right? The Rus, at least parts of it, because it was immense. I recently made a video about Russian warfare, between the 11th and 14th century. I had to make two episodes on the same topic, because there is really even a lot of evidence and a lot of different influences, and we talk about the various neighbors, the Bulgars, the Cumans not yet fully, but yes, we made something about Western Eurasian steppes warfare that deals with that. But many of these areas were much more similar to what we intend as Central Europe culturally meant than what they came to be later on. And that's something that has always fascinated me brutally, as much as how, in fact, the difficulties, and sort of, especially considering the relentless, cyclical, you can argue, steps, wave, invaders, waves that came from the east, molded this entire area and destabilized a great deal of it. at the same time. I mean, the word of the forest, the one of the Slavs, of the cemeteries, is never the word of the steppe, of the Turks, of the nomads, right? There is a great deal of frontier, especially in the wild plains. In the, if you look actually at the map of what the Russians managed to conquer from Ukraine, that's pretty much like the same identical strip, the corridor that was always battle over, but was sort of the divide between sort of the civilized side and the nomads, right? In fact, in that part, actually today it's actually the same thing in terms of also wealth, aside from the war, let's say pre-war times, or say before the destructions and the deportations, but and aside even from the the previous engineering in Stalinian times and whatever. But and these are things that I look forward, in fact, to look at better in a series dedicated to contemporary history as well. There is a lot of, I don't know, have you ever been into Makhnos and revolt, or in Tachankas, into the history of the Russian Civil War, the Atmanate, etc. I made a video about the Polish Bolshevik War, for that matter, that does take that into consideration. But there's really a lot of history that is neglected, and especially during the 17th century, the 18th, the were the most momentous, the crucial for the history of Ukraine. In any case, today we stick to our good old medieval times that were surely old. They are surely old, and they weren't that good at this, especially in this context, but that are in fact the best that also Eastern Europe accomplishes at this time. So you say what Kiev was managing, but it was really like the gold standard all around. Now, there is, again, today we're going to look at things very generally. Right? There is, for example, from a historiographical point of view, we want to appreciate the ambiguity in the development of a truly fixed, formal, categorical institution, and, for example, succession mechanism in this Kievan Rus. Right? For example, the title of Grand Duke or Grand Prince, because of course these are actually Latin translations, like of terms that were in fact really different. Like in Ukrainian, it would be Veliki Kniaz, right? The Kniaz had, of course, some connections with other European, were etymology words of sovereign, whatever, and the main sense of this is that the role of Kiev was fundamentally hegemonic, right? It was recognized after the death of Sviatoslav I in 972, right? And this came to be highlighted in the struggles that followed between his children, Volodymyr I Sviatoslavich, known as the Great, that among the various places before Kiev ruled also on Novgorod, and his brother Yaroslav I was the firstborn son of Sviatoslav I. Now, the area of Kiev, as we've seen, dominated the region for the next 2 centuries. And this is essentially the moment of a full affirmation of what we see as the Principality, at least in the sense of a first among, and this is the sort of hotly debated notion here too. Like, what were these various some principalities seen as sub, right? Were they really to be considered as the emanation of the Rurikid princely, dominance, or was there actually a big deal of autonomous identities? And how this is not for us today to discuss, but there is no doubt also that Kiev have really a dominant position, being the largest center, major waterway, and this access to the southern strongholds that connect, in fact, the mouth of the major rivers flowing into the Black Sea, and so all the trade routes that also connect like the steppes with the Silk Route, and the other civilizations were from on the other side. And so actually an enormous amount of wealth that is a bit like the one that had allowed in a very consistent part, like a trade-based one. There is much of a sort of Viking vibe initially in the way these fortified centers were sort of developed further and were connecting with one another across the major Russian waterways, rather than the hinterland that, as we've seen also from a military point of view, was significantly detached. Like of course, Eastern Europe was very sparsely populated, very few properly interland connections other than, in fact, the rivers, and the world of the forest out there being not even particularly sought after by the same princely rulers. And there is this idea of as we will see now as well, especially after the battle of the Alta River, of a let's say of a popular power, some sort, the Beke, right, that would have had some sort of and there actually was like of countering power, of check function in relation to the princely power of these settlements. Also, as we will see now, the wicked ancestry and or like the contingent familiar, the blood ties, right, were surely used, in fact, by the various rulers of the Rus to sort of legitimize one another side from the fierce competition and fraternal bloodshed, for example. So it's one of those pictures that, even on the basis, say, of the sources, it's unfortunately not really appreciable, because the information we have is sometimes older and or some fundamentally scarce in itself. Or that is not to say that it's not insightful, but it wasn't written specifically for the full purpose of describing precisely what was happening. In any case, Kiev controlled also the major landmass around the center compared to the other Russian ones. This came to be ruled by the same, in fact, Grand Prince, who, in this leading function of seniorate that was associated with Kiev, would formally subordinate his relatives that were ruling in other cities. And this had, again, always been the case, as we've seen just with Vladimir the Great and others. The times were really lords of different Russian cities, also particularly different or distant from one another. Like Novgorod, as we've seen, was not necessarily antithesis of Kiev, but still we're talking about different dimensions, different influences, and also forms of government, at least also in the longer run. The seniorate naturally implied also a form of subordination, meaning the other Russian principalities had to pay Kiev a tribute, right? This is something similar to what we've seen in Poland, except there is in Eastern Europe already an important mechanism derived a bit from the more autocratic steppes, say, models, right, of the great nomadic warlords that, as you know, had even ruled over Kiev. Think about the Khazars. Kiev essentially developed because of this, again, incredibly fruitful frontier dimension in which it finds itself, and acquires a great deal of also, for example, of technical and military capacity to counter the same steppe peoples that are, in part, the Khazars are crushed by the same Kievans, then there would be always this very ambiguous relation with these other guys living further east and south that were technically not important even to subdue, because in the steppe there is nothing. It was enough for the Rus just to control the aforementioned ports, right, river mouths, and not even that sense encouraging a particularly sound level of urbanization like it was emerging further north, right, especially in the western part of the Rus. So the zenith of the Kievan Rus is achieved under the reign of the aforementioned Vladimir. His reign is between 980 and 1015, and Prince Yaroslav the Wise, who was in fact the same son of Vladimir. We are between 1019 and 1054, right? The guy was also Prince of Novgorod from 1010 to 1034, also Prince of Rostov, right? His mother was from Rostov from 987 to 1010. There are, as we'll see now, some significant connections with Scandinavia still, because the Varangians had somehow, if not established the principality, at least led politically the process for which the Slavic elites would accept them coalescing in such level of interconnection between the various principalities. Both these rulers continued the territorial expansion of the Kievan Rus that had started back in the day, since the times of Olga the Wise, who was credited with the proper foundation of the principality back in the day. We are beginning of the 10th century. This chronology is quite fascinating, because differently from, say, and that's also what the similarities with Poland in many ways emerge, and so also with the difficulties, in fact, of these eras that never really had statehood, historically speaking, not actually urbanization, like also never analyzed like the political and social system of the Rusian centers that were quite florid, but were also born out of a different form of urbanism, if we so can say, compared to for example, Latin Germanic Europe, and also the one of the Western Slavs, as it sort of was similar, sort of a hybrid, but led by a direct control and from the Roman Church, and imitation also from models that existed, say, in Germany, etc. The point being that this chronology of peak, right, where essentially the time of before the Great Schism even occurred, is quite early. In fact, like normally powers around this time are, like in Europe, the Mediterranean, are peaking during the 12th to 13th century. With some of this, of course, within the Rus as well, depending on which parameters you look at, but the political unity is a different story. Right, it's just like the Piasts. They managed to create in a different way from the Rus, admittedly, because they were there like properly the Polands in the center, what is today's geographical Poland, establishing a control over the surrounding Western Slavic tribes, and affirming actually a hell of a control before this was shared between the ruling dynasty that entrenched in the various duchies that were hardly put together in a functional way until the 14th century. All right. So for the Rus, like we have the major watershed being, of course, the Mongol invasion, the Lithuanian conquest, and in that regard also like essentially a loss in independence of the Ruthenians at large. With some mechanisms that, as you know, are being triggered later with the rise of the Muscovy, also in a very Mongol way, right? Then telling the truth that just Novgorod as the last sort of not just independent but also sort of republican regime, if so we can say, compared especially to the rest of Rus is fair, would archetypically embody. So Volodymyr had been, as we've seen, Prince of Novgorod when his father Sviatoslav I had died in 972, and because of today we don't descend into the details of every single ruler, but he was ousted essentially from there and forced to take refuge in Scandinavia shortly afterwards. And at that point, he is helped by his uncle, Håkon Sigurdsson, known also as Håkon Jarl, that was de facto the ruler of Norway from 975 995. And the guy was a time Earl, supported dramatically his nephew from Norway, so that Volodymyr could put together a considerable Norse force, a Viking one if you want, and retaking Novgorod. We will have surely at some point to delve more into Viking era and various, perhaps, it's complex because we've made some there is not a unitary narrative for those, even if you base yourself, as I did for the World Middle Ages, on the three major Scandinavian kingdoms, right? But also Novgorod deserves alone. And this force was able to overwhelm also Kyiv, right, from Yaropolk, as we've seen, Volodymyr's half-brother, who had, of course, been behind the opposition against his own half-blood, and was reversed in turn. This is very typical of this of the era, right? Now, Volodymyr the Great is called like this, among the other things, because he is traditionally attributed the Christianization of the Saint Kievan Rus, which instead, as we've seen also in the previous videos, been a much longer dynamic. So Christianity, first of all, had been around from ever, right? In the 1st century AD, we do know that the Crimea, the colony, the Hellenic colonies of the Azov Sea, and at that point under the Roman Empire had, and at least its sphere of influence would consolidate there, converted already, of course, to Christianity. The primary chronicle that, as you know, is the Russian primary chronicle, written in the 10th of the 12th century, to the practically most important source, from about 800 to, in fact, the same beginning of the 12th century on the Rus, is a recording the legend of Andrew the Apostle's mission to convert. It's a legion, naturally, but there was an awareness that had been interiorized by the Rus at that time in the Middle Ages, that an early proximity with Christendom by the pagan Slavic tribes had been a big deal to sort of mold the connections, the trade, the sort of the cultural influence broadly meant, right? From the coast, those aforementioned coastal settlements. This story goes that the apostle would have blessed the same, at least spot on which Kiev would have been later built. Naturally, the settlement continuity did exist, but we are really, a long time before the meaningful, the most powerful settlement in the area would be affirmed, right? So this is naturally a very Byzantine influenced concern. The same Constantinople had suffered of the fact that it had not had an apostolic tradition historically differently from all the other metropolitic see of the empire. So, as you know, Constantine himself preoccupied himself with bringing the relics from the apostles to the same city, and he had also himself buried surrounded by them. So that is something pretty telling about what like a 4th century Roman emperor, like just approaching Christianity, was thinking of himself, and that sort of idea of Sevastocratorship, to put it the Greek way, was that still unity, the fact that the emperor was the head of the church as opposed to what was happening in the West, was part also supporting that sense of autocracy that you do find in the Rus, that eventually gets dramatically boosted by the Mongols. The area of Ukraine had been settled by the Goths. We made some video about that. In the 3rd century, these people had essentially migrated from the Baltic. The Gothic ethnogenesis is quite complicated, but surely the initial nucleus was actually from Scandinavia. And no, Jordanes alone is not enough just to pretend that, right? You must reason through sort of more subtle lines. In any case, Arian Christianity had been adopted by these people, famously enough, in the 4th century in the area, right? And we do know this also because in their Bosphorian kingdom, the Goths had erected some churches, right, between the 4th and 5th century. There are findings in Crimea that naturally was the sort of, say, the most developed land in the, say, we can consider Eastern Europe in this sense at that point. And the Huns, however, had cut short this process of Christianization. In the 70s of the 4th century, they basically overrun this Greutungian realm that is ideally what like the later so-called Ostrogoths would have emerged from, like as they would remain fundamentally under the Huns, also constituting a very important part of their manpower, and in any case bringing to such a destabilization and sort of remigration, and especially opening a bit to the Turks from the steppes, like that corridor we were talking about, to sever, in fact, the relations of fundamentally Eastern European continental hinterland from the Black Sea, and so the Mediterranean. And so stopping, in part, that process of further evangelization, because again, if you had all nomadic Turks in between, even for a tiny strip of land, well, the Byzantines had really better things to think about than sort of evangelizing now the Slavs that would gradually expand there, also with not much of a single political reference to say that before, in fact, the Rus emerged politically, right? As you know, the Byzantines tried to convert the same Khazars that did convert in part to Christianity, and even to Islam, but mostly to Judaism. And again, these are all things we've seen, especially in the videos about the evangelization of Europe. In any case, there was also during the Viking era and during the earliest Kievan principalities, some chieftains and family members of theirs converting to Christianity, right? In great part, like the Nords converted from within themselves, right? Aside from the imposition or not imposition, it was just a very clever way of going, just to acquire more power and prestige, especially with in the relation with Constantinople. I'm preparing a video about the Varangian guardsmen, by the way. Probably make this tomorrow. Some examples of this are Ascult and Dir, kind of legendary leaders, but especially Olga of Kiev, that I also, in fact, mentioned in a video that was partly dedicated to her, right, and who was, as the regent of the Kievan Rus, the one who would baptize, would convert, right, taking down the name of Elena. There was a lot of actual, she was a very clever player. She was maintaining contact also with Western Christendom for that matter, but she baptized her son, that is the same Sviatoslav the First. Albeit such central figures like Oleg the Wise, Igor of Kiev, and the same Sviatoslav, aside from the baptism, would remain pagans, right? So that's why you have this important passage with Vladimir, right? That fundamentally stabilizes the full the path to Christianization conventionally, right? So, but the prodromes had been really, really important and also central for the stabilization of the same Kievan Principality as such, right? Being courted by Constantinople, Rome to actually receive support at court, to foster some more permanent infrastructure, funding such important patrimonial assets like the church and all its administration and its sort of further internationalization. This is something that Olga especially played in a very clever way. Now, the aforementioned primary chronicle tells us also another story, that is, that when Volodymyr had decided to become Christian from the traditional Slavic way to Catholic glory, he would send some of his best agents in various vests in different parts of Europe. And so there is this a bit stereotypical, if we have to convert, let's try to focus right on which model is fundamentally the best. And so here there is a bit of a stereotype. This is a legend, really. But the idea is that they would, the Rus would consult at that point, and this is a metaphor for what had been going on given the Russian position in general in that world, right? One may consider it of course, European in a way, but if you look even at their, their fighting style, their general, let's say, even just the peoples they interacted with, to some extent you realize that it could fit also in a broadly seen Asian context. The Rus was really very much a system on its own. It was so big territorially that, in fact, we can observe how, let's say, loose the entire political sense of itself and also its identity to an extent, especially outside of Kiev, that was sort of the most developed, say, culture maker in that context, could be, right? But it's obvious that these peoples had been in contact with the Roman Church, the Jews, Islam, right? And the story goes that Constantinople would have been, that of course they knew very well by the time of Volodymyr, would have been the game changer, because it was unavoidably, given also in fact that position, the most important center of culture from a Kievan perspective. I mean, they were just close. They would have unavoidable ties with whoever controlled the Bosphorus, but just the Byzantine civilizational output was insane, especially considered, in fact, in which conditions normally broader Eastern Europe would burst. The West was galloping fast, and in fact it would manage to include as far as Poland and Hungary, and in a way the Byzantines got the worst of Europe in this broader area. They had from an early day to content themselves with just Bulgaria and the Khazars, right? And they had naturally also their projects for the Levant. This is another story. But say the Rus came unavoidably to be attracted within the Byzantine orbit, and the conversion to the so-called Greek Orthodoxy would be sort of obvious, right? The primary canonical legend tells that, like, the sort of silly reasons, after all, more or less silly reasons, for which they rejected the other religion, that they, in many ways, they would have not adopted for many other concrete reasons. But here the story says Islam, because, among the other things, at least, it prohibited the consumption of alcohol. Judaism, because, and this is actually fascinating, the Rus observed their God had allowed the land of his same chosen people to be lost, historically. So don't underestimate how the Eastern Slavs were sensitive to, and especially the Kievans in this regard, and their sort of power they had been able to wield over peoples like the Khazars, or some of the major regional powers in the area, in terms of divine glory and what God could give to them in exchange for their military prowess, right? They wouldn't essentially understand, according to the story, the Roman ritual, while Constantinople was just so big and beautiful, and think about Hagia Sophia, all the splendor of the historically, as you know, very loaded liturgical service, a very orderly one, a very sort of hypostatically, almost transcendental vision of the same emperors, of their court ritual, etc., that they accepted, allegedly for these reasons, the conversion from there. Of course, these factors did play a part, right? The Byzantines were quite mesmerizing in the peak of their power display. So the story goes that Volodymyr finally accepted the Byzantine rite, and he went himself to Constantinople, where he got betrothed to Princess Anna, the daughter of the Emperor Romanus II, and so the sister, by the way, of Basil II, right? Naturally, how things really happened was through, yes, this diplomatic ties, this obvious convenience, especially after the Rus had, in fact, accepted, together with the Christianization, also essentially the peaceful relations with Constantinople that, as you know, they had tried to attack, without really, say, having the capacities of carrying out a prolonged siege. But in some ways, while the Byzantine army was preoccupied with rebellions, other issues, like, it could also be extremely risky, and truly it did cause severe damage, especially in the suburbs outside the Theodosian walls, right? And by the moment in which a more structured power was to be consolidated, there was no way, like, there could be an opposition to Constantinople. Those early raids were not like a proof of expansionism. Yes, it's true that Sviatoslav, for example, had brought his capital to essentially the Danube Delta, that had been quite a strategic crossroad, because that there is the Danubian Channel between the Black Sea and the Carpathians, from which basically you could control the steppe movements, you could descend and raid into the further south, even into the Balkans and so on. So it was some general threat, but on the longer run it was seen that if you wanted to become really powerful, you had to stabilize your political capacity in a territorial way, and that for Kiev, in spite of this projection towards the south unavoidably, that mostly entailed like a stabilization of essentially of the trade routes with Constantinople and all the other advantages coming with that, but dedicating oneself primarily to the consolidation of a continental Eastern European dominion. And this, as we'll see now, had a lot to do, and that's what the rest basically of Kievan history is about, with the constant struggle over the control of the other principalities. Naturally, Kiev was, through the contact with Constantinople, ever more legitimized to be the actual leader, right? The Grand Principality. All right, there are of course, other factors that interplay with Volodymyr's personally, like in these times with Constantinople. But it's obvious that whoever, in fact, wanted to rule in the Rus would have aimed at Kiev anyway, so as we've seen in these struggles for power, and how the local aristocracy would sort of make these guys float, in part also to accept some degree of autonomy, like to get rid of the guy from locally sending him to Kiev, but having sponsored him to get there, like getting something in exchange, including this kind of autonomy. So again, the Dnipro River, essentially the domination over, say, not much in a, say, homogeneous naval control over the Black Sea, but still being essentially the dominant regional power in the northern shores of the same, would unavoidably foster further the development of Kiev in that role. In the primary chronicle, we are told that Volodymyr is baptized around 987. It's sort of easy to remember because it's the rise of Yug happened at the same time. There would be actually connections between France and the Rus at some point. Because, as we've seen also in the video about Russian warfare, there was an enormous deal of connections with the West, especially in terms of material culture, weapons imports, for example. There is a much greater sort of Western outlook in the Rus than the quite stylized, uniformed Byzantine art would tell you. Like, if you look at some Russian icons, of course, they look very much Byzantine without too much variation, because that's the point actually of that iconography par excellence. But if you look actually at their weapons, you realize that they had imports from Germany mostly. They cared extremely about establishing an ever more compact, heavy cavalry. What is fascinating is that in many ways they were, in spite of all, of course, also the steppes, influence, and so on, managing to do something like that before the Mongols arrived, right? And that's why I say in part that this mechanisms of power sharing, of broader context, and still like an exposure to what was happening in the Baltic, that was being Christianized and feudalized and stabilized, that there was a contact with the German merchants, later the Hanseatic League. So all a process that was actually opening, and this is, in my opinion, the single most overlooked thing, the Rus to the West. Right, it is true because, you know, with the Mongols you have the 13th, the 14th century, then the crisis, and so then countries in Europe sort of, especially Eastern Europe, sort of encloses itself within itself, because first of all it's been exhausted, but secondly it is really, there is a process of further territorialization from within, properly like a territorial basis until, say, the 13th century. From the 11th to the 13th, here we are in the age of sort of long-range relations, because the world is rising and there is a sort of universal principle behind all this. And so while the Rus is not particularly documented, we get, not even for this period, we do get an enormous amount of, especially archaeological evidence regarding the westernization of the Kievan military. This is a radically important aspect of the story. Going back to the primary chronicle, the idea is that eventually the entire population of Kiev was baptized in August 988 after Volodymyr, and that, of course, there was some resistance all over the Rus to this decision, because it also entailed, like from the establishment of a Kievan church, like the fact that all the other churches of the Rus should have depended administratively on that. So it was a struggle, essentially, for centralization, decentralization, respectively. Novgorod, Suzdal, Belzersk, they all put up some resistance, but you know that the broader pattern was just already evident, and these places were not. They had already Christians within there. It's just that they were opinating at an elite level whether they should have accepted, so let's say, directly the Kievan control in their affairs. Now, the adherence to the Greek Orthodox Church opened to, in fact, this eventually unavoidable that comparatively tsunami sort of Christianization and acculturation, right, at every level. And so, for example, the church now had a liturgy written in Cyrillic. A body of translations from Greek had been produced, oppositely for the Slavic peoples already before, of course, the Rus, right, had been formally converting. And this literature facilitated, of course, the evangelization of the entire Eastern Europe, right? This also introduced, just out of theological necessity, some discrete interest in Greek philosophy, science, historiography as well. So this is also how with Christianization, of course, properly a Russian history begins from the local sources about themselves, about lots of things that, of course, the Byzantines had not recorded. And it's rudimentary considering the times and the places, but it is, in fact, like the sources we're mentioning now, they are precious and aware about their own past, what the past had meant, also in function to the present, and what the political end of the same. Say Greek in general had surely been some, if not necessarily a sort of lingua franca in the Rus from some time, because there were so many Byzantine merchants, and this had already opened to some kind of understanding, like the entire establishment, as we've seen of the Rus, had sort of passed through the contacts between Scandinavia and Constantinople and the general Slavic interland expansion agriculturally with the exports in the Black Sea and more, right? So this is kind of obvious. This also entailed that when in 1054 the Great Schism happened, Eastern Europe, like say this broader Greek Orthodox world, would drift away more, of course, from the Western sphere of influence and just contact. It would oppose to it, right? Except the Kievan Rus did not have this anti-Western hatred, like typical of the Byzantine xenophobia ingrained. On the contrary, as we've seen, actually, there was some important, say, also matrimonial policy at some point. A queen of France was Rus, right? And there is an interesting story at some point with my name as well that I will explain. You deeply connected with also the Indo-European equestrian tradition that is also the reason why France acquired in part the name, but it's not so relevant for now. Just saying that again, the Rus as such was very much like a giant on its own, right? Extensionally speaking, it could, and even just because of the internal political balance, it could not or would not or didn't care really to take more than, say, particularly strong stance precluding like themselves from contacting and remaining connected with different cultures out there. There was, of course, like tension with neighbors as always. Not everything went well with Constantinople, of course, but the trade connections, think about even the relation with the Volga Bulgars, with with the Baltic as well. Those were all very beneficial for the Rus, and aside from the religious political differences, they to some extent not be altered. If we look at the reign of Yaroslav the Wise, right, the son of Vladimir the Great, you can spot some of the most typical dynamics that would weaken, however, the internal balance of the Rus, since in fact this very general, the first of the beginning of the 11th century. Yaroslav was Prince of Novgorod, just like, as we've seen, his ancestors had owned different titles, and they were scattered, in fact, on this different thrones, this different principalities. So he was ruling in the north at the time of Volodymir's death. Yaroslav, however, established his control in Kiev in 1019, which, of course, came with a reaction from the other Rusian princes that naturally wanted to succeed in his place and resist his his concentration of power. The wars, in fact, would protract until 1036. There was an attempt during the same time to reinforce further the relations with the rest of Europe. Yaroslav was particularly close to the Byzantine Empire. In fact, his granddaughter Eupraxia Vsevolodna, that was in fact the daughter of Yaroslav's son Vsevolod I, also Prince of Kiev, would become a Holy Roman Imperial Princess marrying Henry IV, right, Emperor. They wouldn't have children. That's also very interesting because, sometimes think about how just by biological chance we have like a ruler rather than another. In this Salian context, who knows what would have gotten altered if a son especially had been born. But this connection with the West as well by the beginning, in the first half of the 11th century, is remarkable, especially when considering that Yaroslav would arrange a marriage for his sister and 3 daughters, respectively, to the rulers of Poland, France, Hungary, and Norway. This is definitely a far-ranging international policy. It's not just, okay, I will simply marry these women as political pawns to someone, right? It's like there is an evident concentration in the West, and while maintaining a connection with the Byzantine Empire, you still have your own granddaughter married to the Holy Roman Emperor. And so there is all a process of intrinsic recognition of also this height. Also, the wife in that case, as we've seen, the couple wouldn't generate offspring, but right, it entailed a form of recognition of the Rus towards all these like the most important powers in Europe at the time. Because if you look at the landscape here, you miss just, well, not even England, because England is still relatively fragmented and unstable in spite of the kingdom existing. But here, in fact, the connection with Norway is especially relevant. You would miss Denmark rather. But aside from this, like there were all reasons why these choices more contingently were made. You realize that there is a continental dimension that ties the Rus to Western, Central, Northern Europe. Yaroslav also preoccupied himself to stabilize further Kievan, the Kievan rule through the promulgation of the incredibly important and first East Slavic code, the Ruskaya Pravda. That is properly the legal code of the Kievan Rus, and as such, the one of the following Russian principalities, when, as we'll see now, the system sort of exploded into feudal subdivision. Yaroslav also built St. Sophia, so the Kievan Cathedral, naturally mirroring the Hagia Sophia of Constantinople. He also, in fact, built another Saint Sophia as the Novgorod and Cathedral. All right, and this was meant evidently to accept some degree of polycentrism. Novgorod was just like quite powerful place. You couldn't do without, also for connecting with the Baltic trade, right? So these churches are all like part of the the broader Rusian heritage, and also just incredible landmarks, right? A great deal of power strengthening was carried out through the grand princely patronization of the local clergy, as well as monasticism. We can imagine a big deal of Western influence in this, because the 11th century was actually the flowering of say the instances of Reformation and the general, a moment of great economical revival. This was true also for the Rus, that in this sense was perhaps even more difficult to control than before, and already declining its overall integrity, because in fact the local centers could afford more resources to just even entrench further, as opposed to just like it had happened today, being arranged in a passage of power, dynastic substitution of some sort by some groups of Varangians, right, of bloodthirsty mercenaries. Yaroslav's children, by the way, developed the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, right? One of the most important monasteries in the city, right? From the cave monastery, founded in fact in 1051, and becoming the preeminent center of Eastern Orthodox Christianity in the region, right? So we're talking about very solid foundations that, in fact, Kiev would never really abandon, right? There is this notion that at the end of the Middle Ages, it's easy to indulge in that, to thinking that, the passage, for example, of the Rusian Patriarchate was just a matter of, it simply moved at some point. It technically didn't, right? The ways, for example, the Moscow acquired that later on, it was pretty shady in itself. Like the territories that eventually became part of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, also Poland, were actually continuing with their own church, and there wasn't really much of another indicator, of standards, like the Patriarch of Constantinople by that point would be distinguished by sort of the unflattering attention of both the Prince of the Muscovy and the Ottoman Sultan that had him imprisoned both. So there was even a moment that's a part of history we have to look at a bit more in depth, but it tells you how much, of course, these centers would maintain, no doubt, like the palm of the most advanced ones of the Rus, but up to literally like the 17th, the 18th century, right? Technically, like the entire concept of Russia in a modern sense was elaborated for the Tsars in the College of Chernihiv, right? It was essentially a Ukrainian made up in a moment in which it was required by the rulers at that point. But the Muscovy was incredibly backwards compared to these territories up to probably the almost the late modern age. So it's something sort of perspectively necessary to really grasp, considering how gradual the development of of an alternative to that century really was, and not for the same cultural reasons. I mean, the Rus, as we've seen, the Ruthenians had managed to acculturate the Lithuanians, as well as not converting them, because they were, as you know, the Lithuanians became Catholic, but there was otherwise an incredible output from the area, right? the Rurikids managed, just like, again, for example, the neighboring Piasts, to remain in power in virtue of the fact of their ascendancy, and to share the same control of the Rus that was, in fact, split in a significant number of different principalities. Like you have, for example, the Principality of Alich in the southwest, where you have also the White Croats inhabiting there. There is the one of Volhynia with Volodymyr, which is also, like, together with Alich, bounding the Kingdom of Poland. Then you have Kiev, that is also ruling over the Derevlians, the Polanians, the Ulich. Alright, you have the control of Wallachia on the Black Sea. Alright, that's the port that fundamentally this would be Odessa fundamentally. The Kievans controlled since that long. You have the Principality of Yaroslav. Chernihiv is pretty close as well. It's an important, say, center's concentration right there. The latter two are closer than Volhynia and Galicia. All right. In the north, you have the Principality of Polotsk that borders in the west the Lithuanians, Latvians. Then in the east, you have the Principality of Smolensk. Here there are other peoples like the Dragoviches, the Radeniks, the Severians. This had sort of been those rural populations that had, of course, their own centers, but not as powerful as the one of these that this princess had managed to obtain there. And further east you have the Principality of Murom-Ryazan, right, with these two centers. Mostly sort of on valleys that were bringing further east outside the Rus to a degree to the lands of the Kumans and the remains of the Khazars. In the northeast, the Volga Bulgarians is not far away, together with the Udmurts. The Maris, the Mordavians are present in south of Ryazan, so made some videos about these peoples, also connected them a bit with this early Russian warfare, also the Baltic one. Then, probably in the far north, you have the Principality of Rostov-Suzdal, with these two centers, plus the Romans, the Galindians, the Manchurians, the Viatics. You have the Eastern Galindians as well across, say, into the Smolensk territory. And in the northwest, on the Gulf of Finland, you have the Principality of Novgorod, that stretches actually, like, Kiev is the most important, say, landmass in terms of at least manpower and labor force concentration, but in terms of greater extension, but not knowing exactly even when the actual control, we should also debate what control really meant in this context, territorially speaking, in a more or less permanent or direct sense. The Novgorods have so much, like, in terms of, like, even controlling even north of Lake Ladoga up to the White Sea, mostly through their commercial power, like the Karelians, the Ku, the Ilmen Slavs, the Vepsians. In the south you have the Krivichs and so on. So it's a very complex picture, really. And this immense as different territory, as you understand, was successfully Germanized, just like the PS for Poland, except Poland was smaller than this, by Rurik's descendants. Right? We do not know, like, at least there is a massive historiographical debate about, given the scarcity of evidence, to say the least, well, whether there was actually any truly recognized or, formalized system of succession, right? Because succession can get messy, there could be some general principles based on this common blood, right? Some propose for a rota system in which the princely succession moved from elder to younger brother, from uncle to nephew, as well as from father to son. Look at the junior members of the dynasty. They usually, as we've just seen today, began as princes actually of other, like smaller principalities, and then progressed to the most powerful ones, so that Kiev was the most coveted throne. It's just like Krakow for Poland. There was a seniorate in that case. In all the other Piast, I say it because the Kievans and the Rusians in general, the Poles, like interfering to each other's affairs. Also, they're actually border each other. Aside from their say the ecclesiastical divide, they also sort of understood each other to some extent, and there were again different shadings between Poland. With of course the southeastern Dutch is much more similar to the Rus, culturally to some extent, and this sort of makes sense, like because it's just a different shade of homogeneity, and for Eastern Europe, we are a bit lost in the mist. Of course, we know a bit better how the thing worked in Poland, for example, but we kind of make it similar, except again, the Rusian Principality was already more sort of autocratic, right? The south, especially, that had been closer to Constantinople, the Turks. The north was much less developed, to say the least. So even the actual consistency of the local, I mean, Kiev was a state to some sort, to some degree. The other principalities, especially the ones in the northeast, with the more northeast you went, like were something substantially different. Consider also on the maps that very often flatten the distance for projection reasons. Like you see this thing immense towards the north, but naturally in the north the latitude is much, it sort of flattens. Like if you look at this as a geoid, of course, the distances are actually much smaller, like more, as you can see from the map of Ukraine, like the spaces are immense in the south instead. And so this exemplifies the stark divide in the difference of development between Kiev and the other Rusian principalities. So there is a paradox, because until Yaroslav, we do not know about the details of this succession system clearly, but we do see that there is a greater continuity with the older clan, right? The older dynasty, which surely depended on this, just a custom of both the rulers and the same establishment supported them. After him, instead, we witness a gradual disintegration of the same Rus, to the point that, of course, the various local sub-dynasties begin to essentially autonomize themselves. This is, again, typical of some other systems that are not quite like probably the West, but the Frankish ones, that tend to instead strengthen, concentrate in power concentration exactly at this point. At this point, I said in Eastern Europe you start having more wealth, and this paradoxically fosters that sort of process of, in fact, feudal disgregation, because it's not that much had been changing in practice, except the need even just to have a single dynasty interior that controlled all this vast space was fading away in function of the local resources you could legitimately accumulate locally to just stabilize, like to ensure an important degree of control, provincially at least. All right. Without mentioning that in all this, the killings within the Rurikids had been really normal, right? Familicide had been always, like the struggle between the various branches has always been there. There is a division that occurs among especially the children of Yaroslav that would take the name after, in fact, the two major contenders, like the Monomachs after Vladimir II Monomach, that would rule as Grand Prince of Kiev between 1113 and 1125. The guy, by the way, is considered a saint in the Eastern Orthodox Church. We're even close to his day celebrated, in fact, May the 6th. And on the other side, the Olgovich that were the partisans, the followers, the successors of Oleg Sviatoslavich, who was ruling essentially from Chernihiv as the local prince from 1097 to 1115, right, igniting much political unrest in the broader picture. So you would have that faction, as we've seen, is pretty close to Kiev, that is ruled by the Monomachs, whereas you find these other guys just very close. You had also other clans, such as the XI-XIII from Turov and Volhynia, after Yaroslav Yaroslavich, that was the Prince of Turov, but also the Grand Prince of Kiev from 1054. You have the Princess of Polsk, right? Principality, also known as the Duchy of Polsk. It's an interesting polity that we can discuss at some other point. But we are witnessing definitely a process of disgregation stemming originally from, again, the same dynasty, and in theory, again, still drawing legitimacy from it, but eventually just for realistically building power at a much more local level, right? And they were all against one another. It wasn't for this reason much anymore the race for Kiev that naturally remained the most sought after option, right? But the process of territorialization of this principalities, also the stratification of some greater, for example, mercantile power. That's interesting, because especially in this early time, it seems that the single centers had, in a way, also, in fact, oriented the policy of the same princes, as these could not simply impose themselves on the local communities in that easily, like in these fortified towns, and mostly because of that ancient legacy of mostly being, let's say, yes, rulers by conquest to some degree, but because they were recognized by the local community, and the lack of a true interland, right? And that could be, in fact, this is the prerogative also of these centers, that they have a very concentrated level of let's say, of assets in there. Outside of it, differently from Europe, where you have, I don't know, in the West, so much a rural base for monasteries or whatever. In the Rus, you have instead like the intention to stick to that particular center. That unavoidably also would again try to compete with the other. The Principality of Polotsk was, for example, contesting the power of the Grand Prince of Kiev by also occupying Novgorod, which was a sort of third party, because it's not that from Kiev there would be this very strong control of Novgorod in the first place, right? But this, say, alliance, like for the Novgorodans to escape like a Kievan control, could bring to these different partnerships. You have Rostislav Vladimirovich fighting for the Black Sea port of Tatar Khan that instead belonged to Chernihiv. At least as we've seen, like Odessa was controlled by Kiev, there was this again concern for maintaining an adequate control of the Black Sea ports, just because controlling them, not even the hinterland was populated by the Cumans anyway, meant to control the Rusian part, because at the end of the day the traffic there came from the rivers, right? So you didn't even need to control that land to cross it if you had like this powerful flotillas, etc. Rostislav Vladimirovich, by the way, was essentially a landless prince. Anitsgoy will see what the concept means. That is, to make long story short, an orphan, right? A guy that, like in current terminology, was probably the orphan that the church, for example, would have to protect. But in this context of the Grand Principality of Kiev, like a prince of the ruling dynasty that was excluded from succession. And so you have in the neighboring, this is a bit the history of Ukraine in many ways, in the eastern part, like this incapacity fundamentally of anyone to control the local territory because of the sort of very unstable, like also unproductive, semi-nomadic hinterland. And therefore roaming around and harassing the Russian supply lines from the south, very often also with the use of the Cumans, the Pechenegs. We'll see what kind of ambiguous role they really had, right? So imagine again the strip that the Russians control today being literally the same that was populated by those peoples. And as a consequence, if you want to reach the sea, because you want to control the ports, you must at least control at the time the major riverways, right? And three of Yaroslav's sons that first had promised, naturally, in virtue of their common ancestry, to rule jointly in this still not fully dynastic Kalisine sense, and again with the blessing of the local communities, etc., would actually fight against one another, right? And one major turning point was the Battle of the Alta River in 1068, which was actually a Cuman victory over the Kievan Rus, right? And the defeat of Yaroslav I of Kiev, who came back to the capital after the defeat. And albeit there were enough forces among the local inhabitants, and properly the Vetch, the popular, like also the assemblies that provided with the militias, etc., to counterattack and defeat the Cumans, he didn't want to arm these guys, right? Because they would have become sort of dangerous for the same prince. But in that moment of weakness, just after the victory, he was objectively very weak anyway, and so he was expelled. Right. This brought to the coming in of the Prince Sviatoslav of Chernihiv to rule over Kiev, that instead levied the local forces, while Yaroslav was welcomed by his father-in-law Boleslav II of Poland. And in 1071 you have actually a victory over the Cumans that for at least 20 years would not bother the Kievans anymore. Then eventually they would come back, because again you cannot really extirpate such people from the steppe in any case, even if you manage to chase them away successfully, mostly through the use of other groups. In fact, you had these other ones settling on others endlessly, arriving from the steppes. So that's the sort of repeatedly ambiguous relation with what the Rus called these Turks like Svoi Pagania, that is our own pagans, right? That is a concept that especially was emphasized after the Mongols, that were not the usual, say, our neighboring, enemies of a time. Pagans, these are something else. By the end of the 11th century, you have even more internecine warfare, right? Vladimir II Monomach in 1097 calls the Council of Lubech, right? It was a princely meeting, essentially, ending the Chernihiv War of Succession between Sviatopolk II of Kiev and Vladimir II Monomach, as well as Oleg the First of Chernihiv. And these guys were fighting over the heritage of their father Sviatoslav II, the guy who had defeated the Kumans we were talking about before. And this had occurred because of the weakness, the inherent weakness that a prolonged fighting infighting among the Rus would have procured. Not just against, for example, these local pagan, say, neighbors that were always in for a raid, as long as like a Rusian crisis occurred. These guys would just raid, and not much would change in terms of the balance between the steppe and the civilized world, but the latter would be weakened, and so further infighting, etc. So again, you can imagine this Kuman auxiliaries being everywhere. I have some content about these very guys coming up soon for the historical military units series about the Kazakhs that you can hear actually switch in many ways as Kumans and Pechenegs, and that's the ones used by the Rus in quite consistent numbers, especially in this frontier warfare. The other problem was really the given that, as we were saying before, there was this cluster of cities, especially Kiev, Chernihiv, controlling the Dnieper River, etc. And an infight within the bigger Rus in the south would allow the northern ones to sort of decentralize further, and so depriving Kiev further of that grand princely authority that he had managed to put together. So by 1130, all the descendants of Vseslav the Seer, ruler of Polotsk, and briefly between 1068 and 1069 the one of Kiev, had been essentially exiled to Constantinople by Mstislav the Great. Mstislav was the eldest son of Vladimir II Monomach, right? By the way, yet another Western connection, that is Gita of Wessex, right? And he's also, by the way, a quite prominent figure in the Norse sagas. His name is Harald in this, and this was a motive to make him connected to his grandfather Harald II of England. This connection, as you understand, was produced by this time by the Norman conquest, right? So the many Anglo-Saxons had fled to Constantinople, and we've seen it in that video about the let's say the first era, let's say, of the Varangian Guard, right? And we will again hopefully talk about them soon again. The most ferocious resistance to the monomachs would be posed by the Olgovich Clan when the Izgoi of Vsevolod II began to install himself as the Grand Prince of Kiev. This guy had been the Prince Knez, that's the technical term, of Chernihiv, and he was the son of Oleg Sviatoslavich, in fact the prince of the same, and he would rule over Kiev between 1139 and 1146. There was this powerful clan, the Rostislavici, who had settled themselves initially in Galicia, right by 1189, and that were, however, defeated by Roman the Great, a member of the monomachs that descended, however, from the Piasts as well, because he descended essentially from the XI-XIII of Volhynia clan, but he was the son of Agnes, the daughter of the Duke Boleslav II of Poland. We talked about him in the video about the kingdom of Galicia and Volhynia, and this lineage would dominate the western part of the Rus. Ersin would be very much involved, in fact, most directly in Central European affairs on a regular basis. In all of this, you have a general, as you understand, also, say, weakening of the individual connections of these houses with a unitary Byzantine policy. The Byzantines actually were, they weren't really declining in the 12th century. Actually, they reached some of the peak of their, a relative peak of their power compaction, especially under Manuel Comnenus. And this also entailed some relations with the Rus that, however, were eventually going ever more towards also a western direction. The main contraction in the direct connection with the Byzantines was due to, in fact, to the development of all these other various centers. So the Rus would definitely not just have its own within the same system, but also being ever more, like, as the individual ones here were ever more individually attracted to other areas, to other orbits, regions, and so on. This, in parallel, as you have understood, was happening through the decline of the overall unity and preeminence of the Kievan Rus as a whole, right? The historical trade route from the Varangians to the Greeks was not as strong as before, and also thus less wealth was passing through the Kievan hands individually. And there were also other, like, longitudinal trade routes forming to Asia. This would, in fact, favor the stabilization of different directions and flow of trade, right? And for considering that also Mediterranean trade was increasing in importance, especially this longitudinal dimension, the Kievan Rus trade itself was suffering as a consequence. The last ruler to maintain some sort of cohesive grand principality was Mstislav the Great. He died in 1132, and this is the moment in which the Kievan Rus starts going downhill quite quickly. This is evident under Yaroslav of Kiev, the successor, like the son of Vladimir II Monomach, who was protagonist of numerous conflicts triggered with Novgorod via Chernihiv as well. He had, for example, to fight against the Cumans that had been solicited against him by his enemies. Right, at that point, by the way, the Baltic trade was strengthening as much as the power of Novgorod as a trade republic, we can say, to an extent, and consequently, you understand that properly the unity at this point of the that at this claim that the Grand Principality could have from Kiev was disintegrating. In March 1169, you have a coalition of local princes led by Andrei Bogolyubsky of Vladimir that sacked the same Kiev among these struggles. This is relevant because, of course, there is yet another, other centers in the closer territorial range that are capable of waging. You see, wars are also a more strictly territorial base. So it's not just an exchange or struggle of power of this or that guy on the throne of this or that principality, but real, hitting one another hard, destructing the hegemony of this or that on the other. So this was, in many ways, even if we look at the Mongol invasion later, one of the reasons why the situation had importantly deteriorated. This is also when, for example, the local mercantile estates can do, that contribute for funding, especially providing logistical support, but also we've seen it in part the militias, especially the infantry, or the technical, the police or seditists and so on, for these campaigns and sieges and so on. But they are also being worn out, right? This time they're starting to feel that, and this would favor, even before the arrival of the Mongols, the sort of dysfunctionalization of the otherwise fairly healthy balance that had occurred between the prince and the merchants. To maintain a tempered power, it's also a cohesive and effective one. It's really in these years that, especially the sack of Kiev in 1169, was really it's not the end of Kiev, but it's just like a symbolical event that sort of underscores a broader, crisis. Right, by the end of the century, the situation had fragmented further, with also small other principalities, the ones we observed before, also were in constant fighting internally and externally. There is also a major event, finally, before the arrival of the Mongols, that is the sack of Constantinople by the Crusaders in 1204. Right, this rendered the Dnipro trade route even more marginal, because of course the Crusaders had all a different system of supply that relied more on the Italian maritime republics, and not like the Byzantines had done, since historically the loss of Egypt, mostly the Ukrainian grain, right? So there is yet another, stall in all this. They consider that all those wars in the Rus had limited the capacity even to export, had caused severe damage, etc. At the same time, you have I just said it, the other principalities are not faring that better. For example, the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, in a broader effort during the Northern Crusades to conquer the Baltic, would threaten the Novgorodan territory. For the Western Crusaders, like there wasn't much of a difference between the pagans and the Orthodox, right? So this is also the reason why, for example, the Lithuanian would finally convert to Catholicism, among the other things, because they had connections with the Rus as well. For the rest, like especially Novgorod was living a moment, especially of trade prosperity, right? And it arrived to control inland the trade routes from the Volga River as well. So we've seen it recently in a video about the Hanseatic League, what the actual attitude of the Novgorodans towards the Hanseatics really were. Like sometimes they would confiscate their possessions, whatever relations, especially in the later Middle Ages, would deteriorate. But overall, the center was sort of, prospering out of the fact that there was less pressure coming from the south. There was definitely, it was profiting a lot just from the broader increase in the Baltic tropics, and so it had the capacity to invest, also to open the trade routes internally in the hinterland to connect those faraway markets. Think about the commerce of fur, of amber. Like Novgorod controlled a great deal of this for the Westerners as well. Plus also the Russian grain is starting to be exported in the Baltic, right? Historically it would arrive pretty far from there in the late Middle Ages, from Novgorod even up to Spain or Portugal. So it's a wholly different trade hub that is being established there, just from another dimension. Like this doesn't technically have to do with the Black Sea anymore. You see how it shifted in relatively few centuries after all. When we talk about Novgorod, by the way, we talk about like a mercantile republic, but it was actually run by an oligarchy, right? It wasn't that radically different from other Russian principalities. As usual, there was a prince that was elected as a essentially military leader by the local council, right? In 1136, Novgorod took the chance to properly and formally rebel from Kiev, because this had just suffered that very heavy blow, and so it de facto became independent. All right. And so there is all a mythology revolving around Novgorod that, however, was also quite miserably put down at the end of the Middle Ages by the most viciously traumatic Mongol, autocracy of the Muscovites. Right. In 1199, the Prince Roman Mstislavich, that we've seen, the guy that establishes the Romanovich in the dynasty, like the guy that is also kind of half Polish, like it has a Piast blood, manages to carry out that union, right, of the two principalities of Galicia and Volhynia. And again, I made a video about this. It's a very interesting story. This was a hell of a political accomplishment, and it of course could be carried out because Kiev had been sensibly weakened, so this area could autonomize themselves better. They also needed some broader, they had the sense of like a cohesion, because Hungary, Poland were important powers in the region. These Rusians would need to preserve their Palatinate prestige and also join into the surrounding neighboring foreign policy. Now, the son of Roman, Danilo, looked specifically, like we are in Mongol times, we will see now, he was the ruler of Ruthenia, right, the prince of Galicia and Peresmi and Volodymyr, right, and he would be properly crowned by a papal archbishop in Dorochin, 1253, as the first king of Ruthenia, the Rus, that he would maintain as a title between 1253 until 1264. All right. And this acceptation of a crown from the papacy, from the Roman papacy, was of course a radical shift from the Greek Orthodox address that the Rus had given themselves. And again, I discussed this both in the video about the kingdom of Galicia-Volhynia, Ruthenia, and in that series about Ukrainian history, because it's something that would essentially lay the basis for the these territories were also, as we've seen, more developed. They would be integrated in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, then eventually taken over by Poland, even in the union between the two lands, and they would be subjected to the Uniate church, they would be established as probably part of a union of these Ruthenian and a church with the Catholic one, right? So they were technically Catholic, but they would maintain some different character, and this territory would eventually be part of the Habsburgic Empire after the partitions of Poland, and it's from that Uniate church that actually the modern Ukrainian nationalism would be fostered and developed further in a way that was, so advanced and capable of being, let's say, exported further also in Kiev, etc. These lands are extremely important because they're big, by the way, and they have that sort of Central European vibe. Eventually, they would be sort of hegemonized by the Poles to a degree. But it's a different story. But they were their own church, and they had this tradition stemming from the very autonomous church of Ruthenia, right? And very much in the wake of the same Kievan legacy, right? So that's a very important story to tell because it literally has nothing to do with the Muscovy, right? And so just those things that Putin was saying and the Poles invented Ukrainian identity that did not exist, this is actually not true. And it just takes to know how these territories had always distinguished themselves from the from the rest of from the Muscovy. That would be enough, right? Even Kiev, right, wouldn't in fact enter that end up under the Tsar's dominion until the modern age, and well into the 17th, the 18th century. So it's not really a matter of opinion or something that these identities, these differences did not exist. Look at what paradoxically the Rus had been up to that point. And so it's admittedly a complicated history, but it's also one to be told especially if you look at the map. When you have this doesn't mean much. I mean, of course, there was a common Russian identity of some sort, but the way these communities would really take a different shape, right, by themselves, is something that began way before Moscow was even relevant in this picture. So it's you want to appreciate that as well. In any case, we witness, of course, with the Mongol invasions to the main deal, like the reason why, as we've seen here, Danilo had just sold for Danilo Romanovich had sold for the Roman papal confirmation, like legitimization, was that the Mongols had arrived. And I talked profusely about the Mongol invasion of the Rus, right? We're talking essentially about we're in the mid 13th century, but it started from the Battle of the Kalka River, right? Which this had crushed the forces of the Russian principalities, as well as the remnants of the Kumans under Curtin. Then eventually there is the actual the actual invasion, right, by Batu Khan from 1237 to 1241 of the literally like if you look at the entirety of the Rus, really, because they went as far as the north, in fact the area of Moscow, Tver, Kozels, etc., Ryazan, and then they went down up to Crimea, and they rose up again to Pereyaslav, Chernihiv, Kyiv, Alich, right? So from there they invade Poland, Hungary. That's the invasion of Central Europe. They arrived up to Germany. Some detachments even crossed the Alps into Italy. So that's the scale. We have already discussed, but we will see better in depth at some other point, hopefully. This is the very interesting story of the situation, because the Mongol invasion puts in motion lots of other peoples. The Kumans, the Kipchaks, were to, be broken by the Mongols, and they eventually scattered. We've seen it in the video about the Lipka Tartars, for example. These were like there were also proper Mongols, but there were Turks that had sort of been incorporated by the Mongols, or that decided at some point to flee in different times. And this also occurred because of the destabilization of the Kievan Rus. The consequence of this, like, you see, the Rus was never directly ruled by the Mongols. Like, the Mongols are much more, let's say, limited in strategic potential than we think. Like, the Mongols do not really they succeed. They invade and crush the Rus, by the way, in winter. For all those people who say that, after all, you can't really defeat Russia in any way, and especially in winter. Well, here's the picture. Ask the Mongols, together with all the bullshit that allegedly humidity would have rendered their bows useless. But aside from that, what happens is that the Mongols do not quite remain in the area of the forest, the area in which the Slavs had lived, in which also these greater cities were. There are lots of reasons why this does not happen, but the main one gets down to the actual difference in culture. Like, the Mongols' oil fields were in the steppes, right? The pastures, probably the basis of power. It's truly they began to rule from. Think about Sarai, right? We've seen that also in the video about the Volga Bulgars. Like, the Mongols, the Golden Horde, does have centers they control. Like, they're similar to, like, they have most of these interests in controlling the trade centers, right? The Golden Horde technically arrives in the east up to the Balkash River. There is not even a real boundary, because it's just the steppe after that. So the Golden Horde controls these territories. It's just like, again, the same identical ones that the Russians control today. And so they're just next door to the Rus. And as such, the Rusian principalities have to pay tribute. We can't stress enough, we just need another video to explain this all, how strong the impact of the Mongol invasions was on the Rus. Right? It is true that, as we've seen, the Kievan Rus had undergone a severe crisis, that indeed Eastern European stability per se intrinsically was pretty poor compared especially to the West, or that's the main indicator, term of comparison, let's say. But the essentials of that dichotomy, as we've seen, that dialectic between the prince, this estate of skilled artisans, like the urban population, the local communal assemblies, etc., it had been working, right? It was a thing that had been shattered, had been eroded. The princely rule, privatization, it had sort of began to kick in with all those wars that had sensibly weakened this whole system, who knows if there couldn't be, like, given the historical premises, but if there had been, right, a strong united Rus, who knows if the Mongols would have even succeeded to eventually control it politically to the degree they would, right? So it was easy, and this process, let's say the Mongol conquest triggers that process of autocratization that you see basically from there on in Russian history till to this day, which is also in part the consequence of the fact that you can't control those territories for how underdeveloped they are unless you use some sort of authoritarian, if not dictatorial, iron fist, which is, let's say, not the best option, but at least it was the solution in different times in this story, like with the dreadful outcome that we see, but at least something more unitary in a land that was otherwise extremely complicated to even think to bring under single control. But this, in fact, is done at a radical cost. Like, basically, the peasantry is annihilated. Like, there are just like princes ruling over people, breaking their backs in the fields, nothing else, right? That middle class that had existed in the great Russian centers is annihilated. And everything proceeds eventually from the Mongol model, politically, militarily, socially. Aside from the fact that, of course, these guys were, the Slavs were sedentaries, they were Christians, and so they were, they were living in a different environment, so things would be different. But that mentality, and even just if you look at the Russians ethnically speaking, like, they're evenly and heavily mixed, even in the most sort of, European parts. And this is not much of a process of communist deportations. It's literally the fact that they notoriously also the Russian elite eventually married into the same Mongol one. Like it did happen frequently, especially in the Moscow, in these places. The others, and especially like the Galicia-Volhynia, would try to escape towards the west, right? And which was even a relatively successful process. The other major dynamic that we were talking about at the beginning was, of course, the intervention of the Lithuanians. The Lithuanians were a primitive warlike people that was essentially and barely resisting the Teutonic onslaught, and that as soon as Ruthenia collapsed because of the Mongol invasion, thought to expand in this territory. This started immediately from the 13th century. The major expansion was after the Battle of the Blue Waters in 1363, which they crushed the Mongols and ended the situation of ambiguous power sharing between the Mongols and the Lithuanians over Ruthenia. And the Grand Duchy of Lithuania extended this enormous territory. It got civilized because of Church Slavonic, of the Rus, etc. In that way, we've seen they had taken from the Byzantines themselves, but still in a Slavic way. So that's how essentially the central Ukraine and Belarus, speaking of modern boundaries, fell to the giddy minutes of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, that got Ruthenized in the process, the drawing from the local culture and local tradition. Also in 1399, from 1398 until the Union of Lublin in 1569, the full name of these lands was not simply the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, right, but also Ruthenia and Samogitia. In fact, the interesting aspect is that since at the 13th century, the Lithuanian rulers, even though they did not control even the majority at that point of Ruthenia, as they would instead do later, becoming the largest state extension in Europe at the time, they called themselves like, we are the kings of Lithuania, yes, but also the ones of all of Ruthenia. It's a bit like saying the Tsars of all the Rus, right, as it would develop later, which stresses, of course, how different and sort of say, divided and so fragmented the Rus was at that point because of the previous centuries. And so just foundationally, even the premises of those powers that we have seen. This is essentially how things fell apart in a consistent sense, and of course, like the later history is mostly about this part in the what would become the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and let's say the rest of the Rus being in a nightmarish situation with, let's say, all the. Today we don't talk about this because we don't like that's not part of the Kievan Rus history as a whole, right? Given that this unity, especially in a patriarchal sense, was broken, but the sense of, again, Vladimir Suzdal adopting in their own claim the patriarchate of the former, like the legacy, like the patriarchal authority of Kiev. That was like, it's not that Kiev had disappeared and locally people were thinking, okay, well, let's give them to Vladimir Suzdal, and even less later, the Muscovy just actually eating up the Vladimir Suzdal and claiming that the patriarchate authority was theirs. Like, that's insane in the way it historically happened, while there was literally a patriarchate in the Rusian Palatinate. It was living on its own at that point. So it's in many ways sort of difficult to even unsee. Novgorod, Pskov, this were, in the northwest, the other centers, like the Vladimir Suzdal Moscow eventually group would evolve into the Grand Duchy of Muscovy, that would eventually take off later, especially from the mid 15th century. That's the history of the Tsars and etc. But we will get there at some other point. Today, again, we stop fundamentally here. I don't know how many other videos I will make specifically on the Kievan Rus, of course many, but for the regional series, of course we should look at the various principalities. Telling the truth, everything Kiev related is welcome, but during starting from the Russian invasion of 2022, I didn't have actually many other, I stopped talking about Russia on purpose. If not for talking about Russian defeats and things like that, of course this does not interfere in the way I analyze this stuff historically. I mean, it's not that I have anything against Russian history as such. I actually, I'm very strongly pro-Ukraine for so many different reasons, politically and strategically. It's not that I have any particular interest in Ukraine, aside from, of course, the history that I know about that. But I mean, I have in my living room, I have a shelf dedicated just to Russian literature, which I read extensively, built up my adolescence. I sort of got interested into Russian history many times. I talked to lots of Russians, I know them. So it's not that I hate Russia. I just have a specific stand politically and strategically, identitarily, culturally. Like I believe in Western superiority, and as painful as it can be to see, of course, when things go wrong, I do not want to incentivize things, anything that can give the impression that I am supporting Russia or doing something to even remotely giving an ideological push, right? So, but I actually love Russian history as much as I love Ukrainian history. Like, if we talk that, then it doesn't mean that I like the people who do things, and including the peoples as a whole. That's something else, right? In the current times that derives from history, and I have feelings for that, but I mean, the history is just the research, the activity of understanding, of learning, and so that's why I make these videos. As much as I would like the war in Ukraine to end, naturally in the best possible way, I in fact, I would like to wait for that to talk more about Russian history, strictly meant. So before we were mentioning the Duchy of Polotsk, say, and that would be a fantastic, that's more like a Belarusian, telling the truth, history. We could make it, right? Like, if you talk about, I don't know, Grodno, you name them, Minsk, Turov, whatever, there is all a history there. That would be a fantastic chapter for the original historical series, but I will not do it. I will just do something generic about the Rus, like if you talk about the warfare of the entire Rus, like a chapter that I made, when was it, in February? I will do it, that talks about all the Rus, right? So it's also, like, if you want to project the modern nationalities, Russian and Ukrainian, Belarusian, whatever thing, all together, so there is no distinction, and I do it. But if it is just like Moscow or any other, I don't know, specifically like today's Russian center, like I will avoid that. I say it openly because I could simply not say it and pretend that doesn't happen. But I'm honest, I'm limpid about it, and I know that I have Russian followers. They must know what I think. I think it's the best for everyone, and like, as far as Schwerpunkt, like, I can make some, I don't know, pro-Ukraine content sometimes, but it's not influencing the way I present this history. Because as you understand today, I was essentially talking about the limits of the Kievan Rus, and probably of the centrality of Kiev, while also looking at the plus. So I may have not done it, right? Because you may think, oh, but this is how it crumbled. It's bad. You don't want to show. No, it's normal, right? It's just like you draw the line at some point, and so I hope that in the future things will go in a way we can look at, say, the whole world without, for at least historically, like for some time, like during the process, trying to like conceive the stuff just historically, and aside from the pain that the current situation just procures anyway. What happens is not cancelled by history is always, yes, like when you realize that we sit on a pile of sins of our ancestors, but in the sense not that you have to feel guilty about that, but that there is so much to fix, right, in a transfigurational and victorious way. Like, that's how it happens. It's not by feeling guilty, it's by feeling actually confident in reasserting your dominance. That's a completely different story. Well, until you understand that, and the measure of that, you can't properly understand even how history can help healing that, right? Because otherwise you would see history just as a partisan way of supporting one thing or the other, right? So I think I see it in a coherent way as far as this is concerned. In any case, I'm glad always to talk about Eastern European history as a whole. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.